Okay, so today I wanted to tell this story about the time that a coworker of mine harassed a rock star. He actually harassed two rock stars, and then a few weeks later, he died in the office. And this was probably 7, 8 years ago, something like that. So basically, at my old job as a engineer, I occasionally would have to go to these conventions for the industry that I worked in. And I'm not going to say what it was, but if you've seen the show Tires on Netflix, there's an episode in that show where they go to a tire convention. And the convention I went to was pretty much exactly like that. It wasn't for tires or anything in the automotive industry, but the general vibe of the convention, exactly like that. Okay, so this convention was in, I'm not going to say exactly where it was, but it was in a mid sized city in the Midwest. And this was not in the city that I lived in, so I had to take a plane to get there. So I flew there with one of my coworkers, and there was a lot of people from my office that were at the convention, but the plane ride that I took, it was just one of my coworkers on that plane with me. So me and this guy, we arrived at the same time, right? And we had a driver that picked us up at the airport and drove us to the hotel that we were staying at. And then when we got to the hotel, we got checked in really quick, and then we went down to the lobby and we took a shuttle from the hotel to the convention center. And when we were on the way there, my coworker was making conversation with the driver, and she was telling us how excited she was for a Motley Crue concert. You know, Motley Crue, the glam metal band from the 80s. I don't know if they're still touring. They've got to be really old at this point in time. But like I said, this was 7 to 8 years ago. So I guess Motley Crue was still doing concerts at that time. And maybe they still are. I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, the driver was telling us how excited she is for this Motley Crue concert that's going to be happening that night. And didn't think anything of it at the time. Just, okay, that's cool. She's going to a Motley Crue concert. I don't care. So yeah, we arrive at the convention center. The convention was very lame. Again, it was exactly like the tire convention in that show Tires on Netflix. Pretty funny show, by the way. But yeah, it's just like, it's a gathering of a bunch of middle-aged men in a somewhat blue collar kind of industry. And the thing about it is, a lot of these guys, you can tell that this yearly convention is like the highlight of their year. Because some of these guys are just like, they go balls to the wall, okay? Because you would think, a convention like this it's a very boring thing, right? And it is, but near the end of the convention, so it's like a 2 day convention, but on each day, near the end of it, they bring out all these drink carts that are manned by bartenders, and you can just get as many free drinks as you want. So everybody at this convention, in the last like hour or two of the convention, and I can't remember if I had one or maybe two drinks, but I got a free drink or two because hey, why not? It's very boring, and you're there standing on your feet all day, so yeah, it's nice to have a drink. But a lot of the guys, like I say, they are going balls to the wall. Like, this is the one time in their life they get to get away from their family and just, truly be themselves and just let loose or whatever. Or I don't know, maybe it's just that a lot of these guys are alcoholics and hey, it's free drinks, so they get really drunk. I don't know what it is, but there was this one guy that he was kind of my coworker, kind of not, because we worked for the same company, but basically the company I worked for, they had an office in the United States, which is where I worked, and they had another office in Canada. So there was a few guys at the convention from the Canadian office, and this one guy in particular, he was a very, the best way to describe him, honestly, he was just like a total alpha male because this guy was probably, I would say 50, 55 years old, in pretty good shape, right? So he wasn't like fat or anything. And he was just very, you could tell when he's talking to people, just very dominant in conversation. He just had that personality, that just very alpha personality about him. And he was a salesman, obviously. But yeah, this guy, when they bring out the drink carts, this guy, I swear, he had at least 4 beers at the convention center, right? It may be more because it's not like I was sitting there watching this one guy the whole time, but I noticed that he had like 4 beers in a span of time that was maybe like 1 or 2 hours that the beer carts were even there, because they weren't there the whole day. So most people had 1 beer or 2 beers. Very few people had more than 2 beers at the convention center. I know I said a lot of these guys just like get wasted drunk at these things, but that's after the convention center, everybody goes out to eat, and that's when the real party starts. But anyways, this Canadian guy from my company, 4 beers minimum is what he had at the convention center, right? So after that, when the convention's all wrapped up, everybody from my company from both locations, right? So there's like, I want to say 10 to 15 of us. We all went out to eat together at this fancy steakhouse that's in the downtown area of this mid-sized city in the Midwest. And it was kind of an interesting restaurant because it was kind of like a Hooters in a sense, because all the servers there were women and they all wore kind of like low-cut tops that showed their cleavage, and they all wore tight skirts. But their outfits weren't like super revealing. It was just, obviously, they were wearing outfits that were for the male gaze, I guess you could say, without being as tacky as a Hooters outfit. But it was kind of classy, And this restaurant, it was kind of a fancy, it was a fancy restaurant. So the average price of a meal at this place was probably about 50, 60 bucks. If I recall correctly, the steak that I got at this place was $70. And, I've never, on my own volition, gone to a restaurant and paid $70 for a meal. But the thing is, my company was paying for it. So I just, I got, yeah, the company's paying for it. Yeah, I ordered a $70 steak. Then I had a dessert that was probably 30 bucks, and I had a couple of cocktails that were about 20 bucks each, And everybody, all 10 to 15 people at my table, all did the same thing, So we ran up a bill of like easily $1,000. But either way, so after we got seated, at first the waitress comes over and we all ordered drinks, and everybody was drinking alcohol, so we ordered drinks, and it took them a while to actually bring the drinks out. And my one alpha coworker, I'll just call him Dave because I can't remember his name, but yeah. The whole time we're waiting for them to bring us our drinks, this guy is just talking trash as if it's like the worst restaurant experience he's ever had in his entire life, So when the waitress did finally get back with all the drinks, when she gave him his beer, he was like, "Bring me 2 more." He was, he was immediately, as he's being handed his first beer of the night, or first beer of the dinner, because like I say, he'd already had like 4 beers at the convention center. He was immediately telling the waitress, "Bring me 2 more." And I thought he was joking at first, but no, he was completely serious. And the waitress did bring him 2 more beers before he even finished that one. And when the waitress did bring him his 2 additional beers, he hadn't even finished his first beer, but he was about halfway done with it, I think. And he just, on the spot, chugged it down and then got to work on the next one. And over the course of the dinner, this guy probably drank like, I want to say he had 6 beers at this restaurant. So, add that to my estimation of 4 beers at the convention center. This guy had like 10 beers over like a 3 to 4 hour period. And that's just from what I saw. For all I know, that guy was keeping a flask in his pocket and drinking even more in secret. But I really don't know. But anyway, so at some point, Alpha Dave went to the bathroom, and at some point while he was away, my supervisor, who was sitting next to me, he pointed over to a table that was like 3 or 4 tables away from us, and he asked me, he was like, "Do you know who those guys are over there?" And I looked over, and there was these guys. It was 2 guys and 2 women, and the guys were like vaguely familiar, right? So apparently, everybody at my table had noticed that there's these vaguely familiar rock stars sitting at this other table, like 3 tables away from us, but nobody could identify who exactly they were. And I didn't even make the connection at first in my mind. But then my one coworker, who was the one that had taken the shuttle from the hotel to the convention center with me, and we talked to the driver, he was like, "Oh, that must be Motley Crue." And then it hit me like, oh yeah, that is Motley Crue. And I'm not very familiar with Motley Crue, so I don't know who all the members of Motley Crue are, but I looked it up before recording this, and just based on what they looked like, I'm pretty sure it was Vince Neil, who's the lead singer, because he had the big blonde hair. And the other one I think was Mick Mars, because it was a guy with long black hair. So I'm pretty sure that's who it was. I can't be 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure sitting at this table, 3 tables away from me, was Vince Neil and Mick Mars from Motley Crue. And they each had a date with them, or I don't, maybe they're married to these women. I really don't know. But one of them was with a woman that was a lot younger than him, but not like super young. She was probably like in her mid 30s to 40s. But the other guy was with a woman that was, a lot younger, like in her 20s, like kind of basically looked like some kind of alt girl groupie. So I don't know, just thought that was interesting seeing what type of women rock stars take to the steakhouse with them. But yeah, as we're sitting there kind of looking at this table at Motley Crue, over the course of the night, random people in the restaurant, including some of the people that worked there, kept trying to approach them and I guess ask them for photographs or whatever. I couldn't really hear what people were saying, but every time they would get approached, Mick Mars would just kind of like wave them off, just put his hand up, wave them off, shake his head, and he was being polite about it, but he was basically telling people, "No, I'm not signing autographs, not taking photos." He's just waving people off politely. But Vince Neil, he was like not even acknowledging people. When people approached, Mick Mars would wave them off, and Vince Neil would just stare straight ahead. And he was wearing sunglasses, by the way, which was pretty funny because we're in a dimly lit restaurant at nighttime, and this guy's wearing sunglasses, but whatever, he's a rock star. I guess he can do whatever he wants. Well, Alpha Dave gets back from the bathroom, and as soon as he sits down at the table, someone at our table asks him, like, "Hey, do you like Motley Crue?" And he was like, "Yeah, I do. I love Motley Crue." And then they just pointed over to the table Motley Crue was sitting at, and Dave just turned and looked, and then he turned back with just like this look of amazement on his face. And with no hesitation, I mean, he didn't hesitate at all. He stood straight up and walked right over to Motley Crue. And I couldn't hear much of what they were saying, but Mick Mars tried to wave him off as soon as he walked up, but he just stayed there, and it looked like he was just trying to convince them to take a photo with him or something. And they kept going back and forth like that. I would see the guys in Motley Crue like shaking their heads and trying to wave him off and tell him no. And then Dave would say something, and then Motley Crue would shake their heads some more, and then Dave would say something. And they went back and forth like that a few times. And every time, Alpha Dave was just not deterred at all. He was determined to get a photograph with Motley Crue. So he would just shrug it off and he would say something else. And after a few times of this cycle repeating itself, I just saw Dave kind of shrug his shoulders, and this is the one thing I heard him say. He said, "I'm from Quebec." And for some reason that I cannot understand, for some reason, that worked. And they took a photo with him. And it was funny because as soon as he got the photo, he didn't even say thank you or anything. He immediately just came back and sat at our table. So it was really weird, but I was just observing this and just wow. Wow, Dave is really alpha. That I was just thinking in my head like my coworker just went over there and mogged, just out alphaed the rock stars. It was truly amazing to see. So, anyways, after that, I did see a few more people try to approach the Motley Crue table, but everybody got waved off, and nobody else was quite as determined as Alpha Dave. So, people would get waved off and they would just walk away. And I think Motley Crue actually complained about Alpha Dave because at some point, this was actually when we were all like standing up and leaving after we were done eating. A waitress came up to us, and it wasn't our waitress, but a waitress at the restaurant came up to us, and she was like, "Thanks a lot, you ruined it for all of us." And I guess she didn't know which person at our table it was that had harassed Motley Crue because she kind of addressed it at our entire table, which is, kind of ridiculous. But as soon as she said that, Alpha Dave just goes, "Go fuck yourself." And we all just walked out. And man, yeah, it was the most alpha display I've ever seen by anybody I've ever worked with. But yeah, a few weeks after that, like literally like 3 or 4 weeks later, the CEO of the company the CEO worked at our location, at the location I worked at. He called an emergency meeting in the middle of the day. He called out over the intercom. Yeah, it turns out that Alpha Dave had just dropped dead in the office. And I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but Alpha Dave worked at the office in Canada. So I didn't actually see him drop dead, but yeah, our CEO just announced, Alpha Dave just died. And if I recall correctly, he had a heart attack or maybe a stroke, something like that. And like I said earlier, he seemed to be in pretty good shape for his age. He wasn't fat at all. He was a slim guy. And he was only like, if I had to guess, I would say early 50s. So, he was not super old. He seemed to be in good shape. He obviously was an alcoholic, though, which is probably what did him in. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was also like on some kind of, maybe he was on cocaine or something like that, because just the way he acted, it seemed like he might be. But yeah, I don't know all the details, but I will say, maybe it's just that Alpha Dave met his heroes. He met rock stars and he out-alphaed them. So what more do you have to live for after you mog Motley Crue? Like truly, it's hard for me to even imagine just randomly seeing some rock stars out in public somewhere and then just approaching them and just mogging them into oblivion. Just making them look like total betas. It's truly, truly amazing. So I gotta say, I have nothing but respect for Alpha Dave. He drank like 10 beers, got wasted drunk on the company dime, on a work trip, made Motley Crue look like a bunch of beta cuck bitches, got the photo he wanted, and then he just said, "You know what? I've done all I can do here. Boom, drop dead. He didn't need to live anymore. He was done. So that's the story of the time my coworker harassed a rock star, or harassed two rock stars, and then a few weeks later, dropped dead and died in the office. And, if you're gonna just drop dead, he did that on the company. So alpha. He died on the company dime. He maybe, his family may have even gotten a payout for that. I don't really know the details, but maybe, because he did die at work. And it didn't seem like it was a work-related thing. But again, I don't really know the details. So, man, I can only hope when I go out that I go out like that, just in the workplace, just, big middle finger to all the higher ups in the workplace. Like, oh, you make me have to go through a bunch of bullshit and, act fake all day, and how about I just die in the office? How about that? You clean it up. Just Alpha Dave, what a guy. What a guy. Truly an inspiration. But yeah, I just wanted to tell that little story. I know this is not really like most of the content I make, but this is just a real life story, that something I experienced, and I thought it was kind of interesting. So there you go.